And we are live. Welcome, everybody. I am Stefano Gennarini from the Center for Family and Human Rights, and I welcome you to this event today on surrogacy and the importance of protecting women's rights in the context of international development, as well as the rights of the child. We have a really fantastic lineup of speakers prepared, ready to speak with us today on this topic, which is a topic that doesn't get a lot of attention, surrogacy, and yet it's a multi-billion-dollar industry that affects hundreds of thousands of women all over the world and children, and it's a booming industry, which is there's very little regulation all around the world. And international organizations have begun to dedicate some attention to the phenomenon of surrogacy, but generally there has been very little work done. And so the speakers that we will have today will begin to highlight surrogacy as an ethical issue, as a development cooperation issue, as well as a human rights issue. We have a lineup of speakers who are really experts on this issue. They are pioneers in the surrogacy, on the issue of surrogacy in terms of advocacy for the rights of women and children. They have experience both in terms of research as well as work on the ground. I really hope that many of you will find this panel discussion helpful and will hopefully open your eyes to a phenomenon that very few people actually know much about, because it doesn't get a lot of coverage. So without much ado, I'd like to begin by presenting Daniela Bandelli. Daniela Bandelli is a Marie Curie postdoc at the Department of Human Sciences of LUMSA University. She's also had a postdoc at the Sociology Department of the University of Texas. She is the founder of a research project called WOMOGES, which does research on women's movements and activism and policymaking on gestational surrogacy in the United States, Italy, India, and Mexico. She's also taught sociology and women's studies. She has a Ph.D. from the University of Queensland, and her expertise really is on the issue of feminism. She is a scholar of feminism. She is the author of a book called Femicide, Gender, and Violence. And she has a critical view of feminism, and which is fascinating. She doesn't come to surrogacy from what you would think is a traditional opposition to surrogacy from social conservatives or from the women's rights perspective. She comes really from the perspective of the discourses surrounding feminism, which is a unique perspective. And she has prepared a report on the importance of informed consent in international development to help women in poor countries or in developing countries on the issue of surrogacy. So Daniela, please. The floor is yours. Please talk to us, if you can talk to us about this report that you are publishing and the research that you've done on surrogacy.
Sure. Good afternoon to everybody, and thanks particularly to Stefano Gennarini and Emanuele Di Leo for welcomed my idea a few months ago of writing this document. This document, which I think you can read on CFAM website and download it. The idea of this document has been, let's say, gestated throughout the project, which Stefano just introduced. I studied in the last 3 years the feminist debate, the feminist discourse around surrogacy, internationally and with a special focus and fieldwork in the United States, Italy, and Mexico. So why I focus on the feminist discourse of surrogacy? My research angle stems from my previous research, as Stefano mentioned, I studied the feminist or gender discourse on violence, which has become in the last few decades the dominant perspective in public understanding and in public policies of domestic violence. Surrogacy is just another social issue which is today more and more debated through conceptual categories which belong to feminist discourse, and in particular these categories belong to the feminist discourse and debate on prostitution. Surrogacy is a divisive topic for feminism. Indeed, there are those who advocate for surrogacy abolition because they think that surrogacy represents another form of commodification of women's body, patriarchal exploitation of female reproductive capacities. Whereas on the other hand, there are feminist groups who advocate for the better regulation of surrogacy, for the legalization, because they see it as an opportunity of women empowerment, as a space of women autonomy. So the former perspective conflicts with the interests of infertile women and homosexual couples who want at any cost a biological child. Whereas the latter perspective meets the interest of these categories, of these groups, under the framework of reproductive freedom. The debate is quite polarized, not only within feminism, but also outside feminism. It is polarized between those who want the abolition of surrogacy and between those who want the legalization and better regulation. But it would be wrong to assume that in this group of, in the regulatory front, there are only surrogacy enthusiasts. It is not the case. There are many people, many groups who work in the regulatory front, not because they are happy with the spread of this reproductive practice, but because they think that it is a more concrete goal to work for protection of children and women already involved in this industry, rather than working towards a goal that they see more utopian, which is the goal of seeing surrogacy abolished all around the world. So regardless one own perspective on this direction, on this ideal goal, I think that there are some facts that cannot be ignored about surrogacy, and also some needs that need urgently to be addressed. So first of all, surrogacy is a means for couples and singles to achieve their desire of having a child. On the other hand, surrogacy is a means for women to earn some money, which usually they use for contributing to their family budget. The amount of money that they can earn through surrogacy is not achievable. They cannot earn such amount of money with any other work activities available to them. So they use also this money to, for example, starting a small business, or to provide their own children with better education, and so on. The second fact that we cannot ignore is that to achieve this goal through surrogacy, it is quite a risky activity. And Jennifer Lowell, I think after me, will talk extensively about the risks of surrogacy pregnancy. In the document I prepared with Stefano and Emanuele, with CFAM and Steadfast, we list a lot of medical literature which show that surrogacy pregnancies have higher risk of several complications than natural pregnancies, miscarriages, premature birth, malformation in the fetus, for example. C-section is a routine performance, as well as selective abortion or selective reduction of embryo, as well as pharmaceutical treatments for the surrogate woman and the egg providers. Then, for example, surrogate women might face some complications during the pregnancy, or she might need some medical assistance after pregnancy, but especially in the developing world, she might have some problem to access health services, as well as legal services, if she needs to be defended in controversies that can arise during a surrogacy contract. It is a high-risk procedure, surrogacy, also for the child. The child can be abandoned, it happens. It might happen that the child finds himself in a legal limbo when he is imported, let's say, in countries where surrogacy is not legal, but most of all, in any surrogacy arrangements at birth, the child is removed, is deprived from the relationship with the body, with the person who she or he identifies as his, her mother. So at birth, all points of reference of the child are removed. She is denied also of breastfeeding and skin-to-skin contact with this person, which we usually call the mother. So the question that is at the basis of the document that we are presenting today is, are women aware of all the risks they face in participating in surrogacy industry? Have they reflected enough on the implications of their pregnancies for their psychological well-being, for their body, for their health, for their community, and for their family? Have they reflected enough on their responsibility towards the child? So I think that these are needs that should be somehow addressed at the moment, regardless one's own position about the necessity of abolishing or regulating surrogacy. And development cooperation actors can make a difference on that, because as it exists, for example, programs for raising awareness on women's rights or to raise awareness on the danger of being trafficked, or programs to help to enhance sanitary best practices in villages. So there is also need of programs that encourages women to reflect on the risk they face when they are offered to earn money through this activity. So in this document, we list a few proposals, a few actions that can be made, can be undertaken. And in particular, programs that help women to be aware of the danger of being recruited or trafficked into the surrogacy industry. programs that help them to access scientific-based information on the health risks they might face, programs that explain them foreseeable scenarios which often are not fully disclosed by surrogacy recruiters, and also to help them to reflect about social and ethical implication of their participation in this market. These kind of projects can be applied either in countries where surrogacy is legal and in countries where surrogacy spreads in a legal vacuum. So if the debate is quite polarized today, this document wants to be a contribution to find a common ground, a possible activities that involved people belonging to each of these two fronts, the abolitionist and the reformist ones. So I think I said everything I was planning to say. Of course, I'm not going through each phase of each paragraph of the document, which is available on CIFEM website. But I'm here for answering your question after other speakers.
CIFEM and Steadfast actually believe that the surrogacy already poses a human rights violation of the rights of the child and the rights of women. But we also believe that it's essential to also inform women, even though countries are not protecting the human rights of women and children by continuing to allow surrogacy and surrogacy arrangements to proceed. It's essential to inform women of their rights, of the rights of the child, as well as the health complications that can result from surrogacy. And that was just a little comment in between, just to understand that, you know, we don't all agree on everything. We don't all agree on all positions ideologically, but we certainly can agree that women need to be informed and need to have the full spectrum of information available to them. Our next speaker will be Jennifer Lahl. Jennifer Lahl is a pioneer. She really put herself out on the issue of surrogacy before anyone else, you could say. She produced a documentary called Breeders, a subclass of women. I think it was back in 2015. It's a really fantastic documentary. And if you don't know anything about surrogacy, I really urge everyone to look at this, to watch this documentary. She's the founder and president of the Center for Bioethics and Culture Network, a pioneer advocate on surrogacy and the wider ethical problems with assisted reproduction and the industry surrounding assisted reproduction. She has 25 years of experience as a pediatric critical care nurse, a hospital administrator, and a senior level nursing manager. Her writing has appeared in many mainstream publications, and she has been interviewed by all the major mainstream media outlets on the issue of surrogacy because of her expertise. She really is an internationally renowned advocate, and we are very privileged to have her with us. And she will present to us the results of a groundbreaking research project that she has been recently engaged in. So, Jennifer, the floor is yours.
I'm gonna thank you and good morning. I'm in California, so I like to say good morning from the reproductive wild, 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 wild west. I'm going to present to you via my PowerPoint slides here. So hold on, let me just get it to full screen. There we go. And hopefully everybody can see that. So Stefano, you were very generous in your introduction, but my most recent film that addresses surrogacy is called Big Fertility. And all of my films mentioned here on Amazon for people to watch. So, but Big Fertility is interesting because it's a US surrogate woman who was a surrogate for a gay couple in Paris, France, and then for a heterosexual couple in Spain, and then also for a heterosexual couple in the United States. So it sort of talks in really good detail about the complexities of these international arrangements to having children. The debate around surrogacy is complex, and there's obviously a lot of problems with surrogacy. The types of surrogacy, is it an altruistic surrogate or is it a commercial surrogate? Is it a gestational surrogacy arrangement, or what we call, which I don't like the term, traditional, where the surrogate mother actually provides her egg as well as her womb, versus gestational surrogacy is just the mother's womb is being offered. I was a pediatric nurse, as Stefano said, for almost 20 years, so I'm really interested in maternal-child bonding and what happens when you break that bond intentionally through these complex commercial contract arrangements, and what are the rights of children to know and be known by their biological families. And then the whole issue around the international problems with stateless children, which has been really highlighted during this COVID pandemic with what we've been seeing out of Ukraine, for example, where intended parents, purchasing parents, have not been able to get to their children. We've had surrogate mothers in America who've been pregnant for international couples and have been, left caring for these children that they delivered through surrogacy because of travel restrictions and bans and all of the problems that come when we haven't addressed this problem at the international level, which is sort of the thrust of today's conversation with what's going on at the United Nations. And Daniela unpacked it pretty well, that there's a stark divide between those who seek to regulate surrogacy, saying that surrogacy can be done safely, without harm, without exploitation of women and children, that all of the stakeholders can be protected through laws and policies and contracts. Whereas the abolitionists say that there's absolutely no way that we can safely practice surrogacy in any shape or form. I am unabashedly an abolitionist. So that is my bias in my presentation today. So I'll just say that clearly so nobody is confused. The regulators will argue that, contracts are the way to protect people. If we just have good contracts, if we do background checks on all the individuals, the baby Gammy case out of Thailand is a good example of the intended father in that commercial international arrangement was a known registered pedophile. And if we'd only done good background checks to make sure that the children born of surrogacy are going to, good homes. Pre-birth orders are a way to protect everybody. So the surrogate mother waives all maternal rights before she's even pregnant in California. So she's not even pregnant and she's already legally waived her maternal rights. And that will protect women from changing their mind and wanting to keep the child. There's a feminist argument that women should have full autonomy over their bodies. So if they want to sell their eggs, if they want to rent their wombs, this is all part of their extension of their reproductive rights and their bodily autonomy. Regulators will argue that surrogates, as long as they have their own legal counsel, so that they have their own lawyer that is reviewing contracts with them, that has their best interests at heart, will be protected. And then ultimately we just need good laws. New York State just recently in February legalized gestational commercial surrogacy. If you look at the New York State law, I haven't seen the final law, but I believe it was a 65-page law. Some tens and tens of thousands of words, trying to imagine everything that could possibly go wrong and putting that into a law to protect. And again, because of my abolitionist view, I believe that surrogacy in any shape or form, whether it be commercial or altruistic, whether you're helping your sister, you're helping a stranger, is a human rights violation to women and children. And it is, in the commercial sense, when a surrogate is being paid, it's literally the buying and selling of children. I have read countless surrogate contracts, And the money is heavily tied to every step of the surrogacy process. If the surrogate does not comply, if she does not terminate the pregnancy, if she does not reduce down the pregnancy, if she does not surrender the child, if she does not keep to the diet that she's been told to eat or the activities, she is in violation and breach of her contract, meaning she will be punished financially. She will have to pay all the money back. And it is a modern day form of slavery. Again, if you look at these contracts, this woman is enslaved for 9 months. She's told everything she can and cannot do. And it's, as I'll show in a moment, it's medically and psychologically harmful to both women and children. And lest we forget, this is just a smattering of the women that I've interviewed, either in my film or just, done print interviews with. And then these last 3 women, Brooke, Michelle, and Crystal, are 3 surrogate mothers, gestational surrogate mothers, commercial gestational surrogate mothers who have all died. Michelle and Crystal are California surrogate mothers who died. Brooke lived in Boise, Idaho. She was carrying twins for a couple in Spain. The twins also died. So in these 3 women right here, husbands lost their wives, children lost their mothers. The couple in Spain lost their twin children that they were expecting to receive. So we do never want to forget that there's a real human beings behind this, what can sometimes seem philosophical conversation about helping people build families. And then, I have, this is the first time I've ever presented any of the preliminary data. We took several years to design a study and get it through an internal review process. And we thought it was very important because on one hand, you can tell stories of women who've been harmed and children have been harmed, but it's even more important to be able to back that up with good data. So we took 97 gestational surrogates in the United States through our research tool. My co-principal investigator, Callie Fell, and I was a nurse. Callie is currently a labor and delivery nurse. So we were very keen to get in and understand better the pregnancy complications. And so we compared the surrogate's pregnancy with her own children and then with her own surrogate pregnancies. And what we found that these women are much more likely to have a high-risk pregnancy during their surrogate pregnancy, statistically significant. And we controlled for the age of the woman and the number of children she had, because we know as women age and as women have more and more children, they just naturally have higher risk pregnancies. And that's a phenomenon that we see in all women. So we controlled for their age and the number of children, and that high risk statistic held. So I think that's a significant point to make. We also saw, as you heard Daniela mention too, 4 times higher rates of C-section. The United States has horrible maternal morbidity and mortality rates. We have horrible rates of C-section where the gold standard is always not to have cesarean section. So we saw these surrogates delivering 4 times higher their pregnancies through surrogacy versus through C-section. Interesting things, what we found that they had more postpartum depression with their surrogate pregnancy than with their own children. Why do you think that is? They go home with no baby. We are meant as women to go home with our children after we deliver them and not go home with empty arms and waiting to breastfeed and nurse a baby. We looked at chronic health, and we saw that women who are women of color had more chronic health issues post-surrogacy than white women, and that could be an economic disparity issue. And then overwhelmingly, women reported that the money was needed for basic needs, such as just paying their bills and getting out of debt. So these are just some of the graphs, that show surrogates who are more likely over here to have preterm deliveries, which is a risk to the children. When a child is born premature, that can be an immediate concern for the health of that child, but then also preterm babies have longer term health problems too, because they're just starting out born prematurely, and that can have long term. And then if you look at the post term, you'll see that surrogates are never allowed to go after their due date or post due date because the intended parents are waiting for that baby. So you'll see, their natural pregnancies would often go to late term or post term. whereas a surrogate is required or often forced to demand to deliver early. And then the second graph here just shows during their surrogate pregnancy and their non-surrogate pregnancy. You see higher rates of high blood pressure during a surrogate pregnancy than with their own children. Higher rates of preeclampsia and eclampsia. These are significant health complications that put both mother and child at risk. And I don't have time to go through all of them, but this sort of held through for all of these questions that we asked them. Again, comparing their pregnancy with the surrogate pregnancy and with their own natural pregnancies. This is our data that we report on the C-section rate of the surrogate pregnancy versus the non-surrogate pregnancy. And we actually asked how many of your C-sections were emergency C-sections. So we had higher emergency C-sections, which means there's an immediate threat to both the mother and to the unborn children that creates a situation where the child has to be born emergently. And then non-emergent C-sections were also higher. Comparing these. And this is the chronic health stuff we saw. We asked them, before your surrogacy, did you have these problems? Headache, stomachache, bloating, nausea, pain in your breast, dizziness. And then after your surrogacy, the same questions. And you'll see all of those elevated. So before their surrogate pregnancy, they didn't have these chronic problems. But after their surrogacy, they now have chronic health problems. This is just our data on the money. Again, 38% used the money to pay their bills and get out of debt. Some just wanted to build up savings. Some were trying to buy a house. Some were paying educational expenses, either for their children, school expenses, or for their own education. And very few were using the money to take a vacation. We asked them the 5 words that come to your mind when you think of surrogacy, and we did a word bubble. And in the middle, you'll see all these love, baby, family, helping. But then on the outer skirt, some of the fainter words that you probably can't see on the slide, though, are things like attorney, heartache, medication, infertility, heartbreak, horrible infertility. And then here's a quote from one of the women, because we asked them at the end just to tell us other things that we hadn't asked them about. And we got so much rich data from them when they just started talking more personally about their story. And this is one woman who said, I did have postpartum depression with my surrogacy, which is odd because I didn't have it with my own pregnancy. She even had to go on Prozac because the depression was so significant. So when I get back to the regulating versus abolishing argument. When I look at the bill that was passed in New York State that tried to imagine everything single complication, what kind of regulation would have made it so Brooke Brown and Michelle Reeves and Crystal Wilhite here in the United States wouldn't have died? And there's no amount of regulation. You can't regulate and make drunk driving safe. We just know it's not safe. There's no regulation. And it's absurd in my mind to think that we could regulate surrogacy that would provide a safety net for women and for children. So wombs are not for renting. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Fantastic talking points, and as always, really broadening our perspective. Our next speaker is, and everybody will have a chance to ask some questions, and you can already start asking questions in the Q&A section, and we'll try and get to as many questions after all the speakers have presented. Our next speaker is Emanuele Di Leo. He is the president of the Steadfast. It's an international organization focused on international cooperation, development, and human rights. They have a really original approach to international cooperation, and he has experience fighting surrogacy in Nigeria on the ground. So really look forward to what you have to say, Emanuele. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefano. Good morning, everyone. I first would like to apologize for my poor English. Steadfast, an organization that I founded, which I have the honor to chair, has been committed to the defense of human rights since its foundation, with a particular focus on human trafficking. In the scenarios where we operate, especially in Southern Hemisphere, including Africa, mostly Nigeria, we found an increasing evolution of the human trafficking, especially prostitution, which today tends to turn into the reproductive trafficking. Those who in the Southern Hemisphere were the victims destined for the prostitution market are increasingly used by organized crime, as well as women to be hired for the practice of surrogacy. Low-cost women tricked and exploited to offer their uterus at significantly lower cost than Western surrogate mother. The learning methodology used is the same as for prostitution. The profile of typical woman for this market is 16-20 years old, low cultural level, destitute, living in a rural area outside the cities. As with prostitution, organized crime use talent scout type professional to lure young women. Once they fall into human trafficking, they are offered to surrogacy company as a surrogate mother, a very profitable business for the organized crime. It has fewer risks. It is easier to implement, and in some countries where surrogacy is regulated, it is also legal, the perfect business. As early as 2008 in Nigeria, as we have fully explained in the document produced, baby farm have been discovered orphanage or former hospital, which have been converted into baby factories. In this place, those who were women destined to the trafficking of prostitution were redistributed for the reproductive trafficking. Most of the women in the facilities were under coercion, kidnapped, locked in a building for months, and forced to abuse for reproductive purpose. 9 months after 9 months. The sad reality of the baby factory is an activity born before the technical scientific evolution of surrogacy. With rudimental means, exploiter forced women to reproduce and then sell their children to wealthy Western people or to introduce them into the adoption trafficking circuit. With the evolution of biomedical technology and the birth of the surrogacy method in Nigeria, the volume of business has increased significantly, and more facilities such as health clinics or orphanage are changing into factory for children. As there is therefore a considerable demand, more and more women are destined to be exploited for this business. The women's market is a rich market, and there are buyers in all countries of the world. It should be taken into account that some terrorist movements, such as Boko Haram, also use kidnapped women to sell them to the reproductive market in order to self-finance their activities. Worldwide, there are more than 45 million and 800,000 victims of trafficking every year. 72% are women. of which 23% are girls. Most of them are destined for the prostitution market, which, as we have seen, is evolving into a reproduced market. Out of just 9 countries analyzed, there are 2,200,000 victims of prostitution trafficking, which, if reconverted in reproductive trafficking, would you generate a turnover of 177 billion annually, only in 9 countries. We live in an era of bioeconomy, which seems to reduce life to a commodity. What, according to some feminist thinkers, should have been a scenario of the evolution of female freedom, that is, the control of motherhood become the driving mechanism from increasing the economic exploitation of women's bodies, creating a real trade of life. Having removed all ethical, moral, and religious limits, the economy appropriates life, assigning a value to everything. Of all the actors involved in the horrific of surrogacy, the only winners are the multinational of reproduction and crime, from which the market withdraw huge profit. The woman, on the other hand, remain a complete exploited subject, assuming the second nature of surrogate, that is a product in third hand, which meaning the process of manipulation of life. Thanks. Sorry for my English.
Thank you, Emanuele. Actually, that was very, very helpful. Jennifer spoke before of how de facto surrogacy is of itself a form of slavery, because women are kept as slaves for the 9 months in which they gestate a child within them, a child who is not theirs and who she will have no claim over. And you spoke, you specifically addressed how actually surrogacy is becoming a market of slaves, and how it is increasingly linked to the international slave trade as it exists today, modern forms of slavery, and in particular prostitution. As a lawyer, one of the things that I've always been shocked by is how, when it comes to surrogacy and when it comes to artificial reproduction, international human rights is read by international organizations in a very narrow way. I don't know if many of our listeners are aware of, but in the last couple of years, the Special Rapporteur on the Sale of Children, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Sale of Children, has dedicated significant attention to the issue of surrogacy in 2 reports. The first ever on surrogacy from the UN system. And in these 2 reports, the rapporteur is a UN human rights expert whose opinions will then be cited by UN agencies, no doubt, as well as the work of the United Nations more broadly. And the opinion of the expert is that surrogacy can be carried out in a way that does not constitute the sale of children. One of the things that CFAM and Steadfast were very happy to work with Daniela on is reporting how there is a lot of dissent from this. There's a lot of international groups, grassroots movements against surrogacy who do not think that surrogacy can be done in a way that does not constitute the sale of children, or that can be done in a way that is safe for women, or that does not violate the rights of women, as Jennifer said, and that it is currently violating the rights of women, and in particular the rights of the child. I've always been particularly struck by the fact that the rights of the child seem to be ignored. You know that Article 7 of the Convention of the Rights of the Child states very specifically that the child, every child, has the right to both know and to be cared for by his or her mother and father. When in the law you have the coupling of two elements like this, both to know and be cared for, it means that they are both essential to that right, that you can't separate them artificially. And that's exactly what surrogacy does. What the way that the lawyers for the United Nations Secretariat, specifically the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, who services the Office of the Rapporteur on the sale of children, they've gotten around Article 7 of the Convention of the Rights of the Child by saying that you can simply fulfill the right to know and be cared for by of the child, to know and be cared for by his parents, by simply allowing access to origins. That's what they call it. They call it access to origins, so that there's some kind of bureaucratic fulfillment of a record of where the child came from, and that's sufficient to fulfill this right to know and be cared for. As an organization that works with human rights, we are very troubled that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights would take such an approach. As any human rights lawyer knows, human rights must be read as broadly as possible, and they must be restricted as little as possible. This is Human Rights Law 101, Constitutional Law 101. You cannot restrict fundamental human rights. So if the child has a right to know and be cared for by his mother and father, this right has to be read as broadly as possible. And to simply say that you can fulfill this right by putting down the name of a sperm donor on a piece of paper that gets buried in some clinic somewhere it encourages a tokenistic approach to human rights that encourages human rights abuse ultimately, and reducing human rights fulfillment to just a tokenistic approach. So I'm sorry to be long-winded, but as a lawyer and a very passionate Italian, I tend to want to speak my mind. But we have several questions, and they are all excellent, and I hope we get around to addressing several of them. We have at least another 15 minutes. Lots of compliments for all the panelists here in the chat box. Somebody here who says they attended CSW in 2015 when you came, Jennifer, if you remember, and showed the videos. And they remember it was that year that it snowed during CSW. This year at CSW, we also have we actually have there were several events on surrogacy here at CSW this year, mostly from the abolitionist side of things, which were very good. I also wanted to note for everyone that there was a very large manifestation against surrogacy organized by Manif pour Tout in France a couple of weeks ago. They always have fantastic demonstrations, very visually stunning demonstrations in Paris. Somebody asked here, Emanuele, you spoke of the nexus between trafficking and surrogacy in Nigeria and in developing countries, but somebody spoke is asking, is there a nexus between trafficking and surrogacy here in the United States? And then another question, and maybe we can answer them together. Jennifer, you'll go first. Isn't it true that surrogacy increases the risk of ovarian cancer, partly due to the hormones needed to support the pregnancy? Jennifer, if you could respond to those questions.
Yeah, I think it was just 2 months ago, a surrogate who lives in California, very near to where I live, contacted me, and I interviewed her. The whole interview is on YouTube, so I can send a link if people want to listen to that. But it's clearly a case of trafficking. She was a surrogate mother for a couple that lives very close by here near me in California. It was a couple from India, and she's a white Caucasian American surrogate, and she did 2 surrogate pregnancies for this couple. And less than a year ago, she had the FBI show up on her front doorstep, asking her questions about how many children she had. And apparently the intended father that she was a surrogate for had forged one of the birth certificates from one of the surrogate children she'd given birth to. So it listed her still on the birth certificate as the birth mother. And he had made 50 copies of this birth certificate with 50 different children's names on them. And so she is now part of a huge FBI investigation into this baby trafficking, baby selling ring. This particular intended father is currently serving a life in prison in the state of Arizona. He was picked up in Florida, where he was having sex in a hotel room with an underage minor, and filming that and posting pornography. So it was investigating him as they pulled him out of this pornography ring that they found that he had these 50 certificates with different children's names. So it's clearly a case that the FBI is investigating into child trafficking. So I think that is obviously very telling. And then as far as the fertility drugs, and I think was specifically asking about ovarian cancer. Is that, you said ovarian cancer? I don't know. I don't know if, we know that there's links between fertility drugs and cancers. As far as actually studying, again, a surrogate mother who's taking fertility drugs and what kind of risk to these women are there, we just don't know. So much of this is brand new. And so we're learning as we go, which is, again, back to the point of why we did the research, because there's just so little out there. So there's so much more that we need to better understand.
We had some questions about estimates in the actual total amount of numbers of the surrogacy industry, of how much money is actually dedicated to this. We also had a question about health problems, whether there are similar health problems with women when they offer the child for adoption after birth, or similar health problems in couples who offer their organs for money. An interesting question.
Stefano.
There are also several people who insist that, yes, that the rights of the child are inviolable, and the rights of women are inviolable, and surrogacy is without a doubt a human rights violation. So I'd like to know if any of you would like to address the question of how large the industry is, the surrogacy industry is. Can someone, any of the panelists, Jennifer, Emanuele, Daniela, are there any estimates that you're aware of?
It's in the 20 billion.
Go ahead, unmute yourself.
I'm unmuted.
Se intervengo in italiano, Daniela mi aiuta nella traduzione. Non si riescono ad avere delle cifre per quanto riguarda il traffico clandestino della criminalità di madri surrogate nei confronti di paesi dove la maternità surrogata è permessa, è legale, perché è ancora un traffico molto nascosto e difficile da riuscire a intercettare. Ma avendo noi un'attività forte, diciamo, specialmente sul territorio della Nigeria, che è uno dei paesi dove al mondo mette sul mercato più donne vittime di prostituzione, riusciamo
Hold on a second. Let me translate that for so that we can do it simultaneously. Yeah. So he was saying that generally speaking, it's very hard to make estimates, but in the context of Nigeria, where Steadfast has been involved for a long time and they have a strong presence, they are able to make some estimates.
quello che noi riusciamo a monitorare è che la criminalità sta cambiando fase e quindi sta trasformando la prostituzione in traffico procreativo, perché è molto più redditizio, porta molti più soldi, è legale in alcuni paesi, quindi basta prendere la donna che era destinata alla prostituzione, portarla presso una clinica di surrogacy e...
Sorry, let me translate that. So rather than estimates, what they have noticed and what they have been able to monitor is how the prostitution, the trafficking industry is moving more and more towards becoming a reproductive trafficking industry, because it is a lot more lucrative and than the other forms of trafficking.
L'esempio che io faccio, come in Italia, prendere chi costruisce una casa che è di italiano ha un costo molto elevato. Se prendiamo un extracomunitario, una persona che viene dal sud del mondo, ha un costo molto migliore. Stesso identico ragionamento viene fatto da queste multinazionali di surrogacy, che per spendere di meno preferiscono, invece di prendere madri surrogate occidentali che hanno un costo elevato, trovare e prendere queste madri surrogate che vengono dal sud del mondo, che hanno un costo minore per l'impresa.
So, and there's the multinational companies. There are these conglomerates of companies that operate across borders, save a lot of money by coming to countries, developing countries like Nigeria, and using surrogates in the developing world. Because and therefore they're able to maximize their profits in that way.
Quindi possiamo suddividere la cosa in tre fasi. La prima fase è quando queste cliniche di surrogacy hanno creato delle loro equipe specialiste per mandarle nei paesi appunto del sud del mondo a cercare, a fare da talent scout e reclutare madri surrogate. Poi c'è una seconda fase, quando la criminalità e gruppi di business, diciamo, criminali, che hanno fiutato, diciamo, l'affare, hanno iniziato loro a proporre alla clinica di surrogacy di essere intermediari per trovare i madri surrogate. E adesso siamo purtroppo nel terzo step, dove le cliniche di surrogacy non si affidano neanche più a questi terzi soggetti come intermediari, ma vanno proprio loro stesse nei paesi del sud del mondo, impiantando delle succursali di cliniche proprio lì sul territorio per poter applicare e fare appunto la surrogacy.
There's three phases in the industry. There's they start with recruiting, the recruiting, and they then bring women from the developing world to places where they're subject to the surrogacy practices. But increasingly now there's a third phase, which is that they are bringing clinics directly into developing countries to use as baby farms, you could say.
E tutto questo ha generato un business molto elevato, specialmente in paesi dove appunto la maternità surrogata non è regolamentata, faccio l'esempio della Nigeria, e quindi queste multinazionali possono fare come vogliono e cercano di trovare modi giuridici per poter operare.
Because the industry is entirely unregulated, and there's no way of stopping it. In countries like Nigeria, these multinational companies are really able to do whatever they want.
Che sono poi le stesse identiche compagnie. Ho visto delle domande che parlavano appunto di Kiev, del caso di Kiev che noi abbiamo seguito personalmente, che trovano sempre degli escamotage per poter arginare le regole di altri paesi che non permettono la surrogacy, come l'Italia.
Because not all countries have the same rules, the surrogacy multinational companies, they're able to skirt rules by going across borders. He was answering specifically to some of the questions regarding Ukraine.
Regarding Ukraine, somebody in the chat box also said that the United Nations office in Ukraine, whether UNICEF, UN Women, and all the rest of the UN agencies have actually never even discussed the issue of surrogacy, not even with all the scandals that have been taking place there recently. I see you shaking your head, Daniela. Do you want to say something on this? Because I wonder if you have a perspective on this, specifically in light of the fact that your document calls for international development cooperation to raise awareness on this issue.
Yes, I am shaking my hand because I just remember when I first started to study this topic, in the past, I worked in the international development sector as a communication person, so I know a little bit of that sector. So when I started to study surrogacy, I really expected, but I was sure that UNICEF, UNFPA, UN Women would have had some programs like on the ground to face this new or not very new today phenomenon. But as I learned throughout my journey, also with the collaboration of Stefano, who is I think the most expert in this panel about the UN policies on surrogacy, actually there is very little engagement of these agencies in the topic. So I understand the astonishment, because I am still astonished that it's not like a simple parallel. There are programs to help to teach to raise hands in poor countries, but there is no programs to make women aware about the health risks of highly invasive medical procedure as surrogacy. So that is my answer.
Somebody raises a very important point, which is that what about altruistic surrogacy? Because that seems like India has adopted a law permitting only altruistic surrogacy after there were several scandals. I was hoping that you would raise your hand, Jennifer. And Jennifer, if could you talk a little bit about regulation versus prohibition, and specifically on the issue of altruistic surrogacy?
Yeah, well, I always get back to the women that died. They didn't die because they were being paid, and if we hadn't paid them, they would still be alive. The health risk that these women have in these high-risk pregnancies isn't mitigated because they're paid or not paid. It's the same argument with, well, can a woman help her sister? Which is an altruistic act too. She's not being paid, she's doing this for her sister. Would you want your sister to put herself in a state of risk to the point where your sister might lose her own life or her own fertility? In our survey, there were several surrogates that reported after their surrogate deliveries, they had to have total hysterectomies. So that rendered them, losing the ability to ever have any more children of their own. So this notion that if we just take the money, the money is hugely problematic. I mean, never have we really seen in medicine where women are paid well, handsomely, to put themselves into a medically risky situation. But removing the money does not do anything to address the health risk, the maternal-child bonding. I noticed in the chat box, somebody was asking about what's the long-term impact of this on the children. Again, because this is a pretty relatively new phenomenon, we don't know yet. We have parallels. We can look at children who have been adopted and raised, in homes without any biological connection. We can look at the donor conceived, specifically people who are here because of sperm donation, who have now come of age and they're organizing and they're speaking out and they're doing their DNA testing. They're demanding access to an original birth certificate. So we can look at parallels, but we still don't yet know how these children who will grow up, and part of their story is they were bought and sold.
I just want to highlight one thing for our listeners before I turn it over to Grace Milton from the Heritage Foundation for some closing remarks. one of the most fascinating aspects of the research that Daniela Bandelli has done is to point out how the narrative surrounding personal bodily autonomy for women isn't sufficient to address the surrogacy issue, and that it's absolutely necessary to take into account the actual health risks to women as well as their human rights. Very much what Jennifer also was highlighting. The stories and the numbers that Emanuele brought up, in particular from about baby farms, the idea of baby farms is just shocking. And I hope that everyone who listens to this event does more, looks more into this, will maybe be inspired to write an article, will maybe be inspired to do a video, will maybe be inspired to share this event. This event will be available afterwards as a webcast. And I hope that somebody really, some of you will really catch fire and carry this issue forward, because not enough work is being done on this issue. A lot more needs to be done. And I will also invite, if anyone listening, to support our panelists in their work, as well as the organization sponsoring this event. And with that, I'll turn it over to Grace, who's Grace Melton from the Heritage Foundation, which co-hosted this event with CFAM. Take it away, Grace.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to just thank Daniela and Jennifer and Emanuela for those really illuminating presentations. And thank you, Stefano and CFAM, for convening this important discussion. My name is Grace Melton. I serve as the Heritage Foundation Senior Associate for Social Issues at the United Nations. And I know we're running long, so I'll just take a few moments to share some closing thoughts. As many of you know, political and social support for surrogacy, both altruistic and commercial, has been increasing in the United States, with New York's legalization of commercial surrogacy just last month as a prime example, as Jennifer mentioned. The partnership of the fertility industry's big money with the political influence of LGBT advocates in particular is powerful, especially here in the US. As we've heard today, the international community recognizes that surrogacy arrangements are rife with ethical and legal considerations, and the varied landscape of laws and policies across the globe pose many challenges. But as many have already said today, clarifying the legalities and increasing regulations really do not address the root problem of surrogacy and the multitude of ways it harms women and children. The idea of a right to assisted reproductive technology, such as surrogacy, is a logical progression of the assumed right to abortion that accompanies the separation of sex from procreation. But conservatives, and I would argue all proponents of women's and children's rights, must prioritize the dignity of women and the needs of children, and oppose the practice of surrogacy because it is both anti-woman and anti-child. So I leave you with that thought, and thank you all so much.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There are some questions in the chat asking when the report will be.
The report should have been on our website already.
Okay.
Apparently there was a couple of typos in the report that had to be scrubbed still. So by the end of today, it will be on our website, CFAM, and
Okay.
I will share the hard copy so that also Daniela and Emanuele will be able to publish it on their websites.
All right. So the CFAM link.
And also the link for this event will be available on the CFAM website in the events tab on the CFAM website. The CFAM website is www.c-fam.org, and I'll put it here in the chat box so that everybody can see it. Thank you again to everyone.
Stefano, posso chiudere con un'ultima cosa, un appello a tutti quanti.
Oh, Emanuele wants to make an appeal to us, so let's hear.
Noi in Europa, come voi negli Stati Uniti, stiamo soffrendo molto per questa pratica abominevole e stiamo cercando di fare una guerra a tutte armi, diciamo, per unire il mondo del terzo settore, quindi delle ONG, il mondo della politica e il mondo della cultura, per creare...
We are trying to fight a war on multiple fronts here, the world of culture, the world of politics, and the world of NGOs.
L'intento è quello di unirci, perché se rimaniamo divisi perderemo questa guerra. Solo uniti potremmo vincerla.
And the important thing is to be united, because if we are not united in this war, there is no way for us to win. There is no way that we can win this battle. We have to unite.
E presto, tramite appunto Stefano, vi faremo sapere, perché stiamo organizzando a livello europeo a Bruxelles un convegno internazionale, 3 giorni, sull'utero in affitto, per mettere appunto in comune accordo le voci della cultura, della politica e dell'attivismo.
And we will be in touch to communicate an initiative that we're hoping to have a congress in Brussels to unite these 3 dimensions: culture, politics, and activism.
Grazie a tutti e grazie a Stefano per questa ottima opportunità, e anche a Grace per averci permesso questo.
Thank you very much to everyone for this event, and I will close the meeting with that. Thank you very much to all.
Thank you.
Thank you.